Tēnā koutou katoa, and good afternoon and warm welcome to Te Whare Wānaka o Laki University. It's a pleasure to welcome you to another event in our 2026 Excellence Series. The Excellence Series celebrates the depth and impact of research at Lincoln University, providing a platform for our academics to share knowledge that informs real-world decision-making, sparks meaningful discussion, and supports the future resilience of New Zealand's land-based sectors. Today's seminar explores a question that sits at the heart of agriculture's response to climate change. Should our focus be on mitigation, adaptation, or both? Climate change is already reshaping the way farming systems operate. More frequent droughts, changing rainfall patterns, increasing temperatures, and growing pressures to reduce agricultural emissions mean farmers are making decisions in an increasingly complex environment. The challenge is not only understanding what changes are needed, but what strategies are practical, effective, and economically viable under New Zealand conditions. To help us explore this important topic, we are delighted to welcome Professor Derrick Moot. Derrick leads Lincoln University's internationally recognised Dryland Pastures research group, where his research focuses on building resilient farming systems through improved pasture species, water use efficiency, and sustainable grazing management. For decades, Derrick and his team have worked alongside farmers to develop practical, science-based solutions for some of New Zealand's most challenging dryland environments. His pioneering work on lucerne has transformed farming practices across drought-prone regions in New Zealand and influenced pasture management internationally, from Patagonia to Australia. His research demonstrates the power of long-term field science to deliver lasting benefits to both productivity and environmental sustainability. Today, Derrick will examine the climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies currently available to New Zealand farmers, drawing on decades of research and on-farm experience to discuss what works, where the trade-offs lie, and how science support resilient and productive farming systems into the future. It promises to be a highly insightful and highly relevant discussion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Derrick Moot. Thank
you. Thanks, Grant, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate that we're busy, and it's a beautiful day outside, so being inside is probably not the best thing to be doing. But I also was fortunate that Katie shared the distribution list with me of people who were attending, and I know there are some that have heard a lot of me speaking before and others haven't heard me speak at all. So some of you will have heard some of the things I've got to say, others may not have. So what I thought I'd do is actually have a look at climate change and where we're at, think about mitigation or adaptation, look at the implications for New Zealand pastures and our responses, so how we responded to it, and then look at some of our current research, and how do we create, and then think about how do we create an innovative environment so that we can tackle these challenges. Are we doing it well or not? So global issues in a New Zealand context. For my research, which is predominantly applied, it's very farmer focused and facing, I've had funding from a number of industry organisations and commercial funders, and I'm grateful for that. Less from government, and I've been in a space that really they haven't been that interested in funding for decades, so that's okay, I can live with that. Well, keep going. It doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. So, there's me. EXI, you can find me, okay? That's me in my agronomy class as a Bachelor of Agricultural Science graduate in about 1986. Ready to take on the world, but no idea what I'm going to do. Absolutely none. And I think that's where a lot of students end up at the end of their fourth year. I went and worked for a couple of years, and then I came back and did a PhD on peas. And I harvested 28,500 individual plants, and Mike Dunby is here, he was responsible for that, and I've held him responsible ever since for me having to do that. But it gave me the understanding of what it takes to get good data. I finished my PhD here at Lincoln, and I went to the UK, and I visited 87 pubs in this real ale book. And so I enjoyed the beer, and my wife enjoyed the morning teas or the lunches that were there. So I thought the Farmer's Arms was a pretty good one to go to. But the interesting thing for me was when I went to the UK in the early 1990s, they weren't interested in production agriculture. They were actually only interested in environment, so it was beetle banks or climate change. Now, early 1990s, climate change wasn't really something that was being talked very much about in a New Zealand context, but I did and was involved in some of the very first experiments that were done on wheat on climate change. And so this is an open top chamber, and we were looking at the impact of CO2 and temperature changes on wheat. I came back to New Zealand, was fortunate to pick up a lecturing position here at the university, and mentored by two of my colleagues, Dick Lucas and Warwick Scott. You can achieve a lot if you give away a good idea. I think it's been a really good mantra for me. I've got more ideas than I have time to research them. I'm very happy to give away ideas. And Warwick Scott, practical science in the service of rural industries. And that's sort of the space that I operate in, is trying to service the rural community that Lincoln has a real affinity with. I don't do it alone. I've been really fortunate. I've got 4 or 5 key staff, academics and technical staff that have worked with me, but we've had a rolling plethora of postgraduate students and visiting interns, etc., that have come in and helped us in our research program. And for any of you that know me, you will know that actually all of the stuff I'm going to present to you today, I didn't collect any of the data and I didn't prepare any of the slides, because I had other people that can do those jobs for me and are much better at it than I am. So, when I was thinking about when you think about how to talk to farmers, the organisational psychologist Adam Grant suggests that there are 4 ways in which we communicate. We communicate in a preacher basis, faith-based with no proof required; a politician, no training required; prosecutors, flaws in other people's arguments. So the truth is not really required, but that's how lawyers operate. So I can argue both sides of a particular argument. And the 4th one being how scientists operate. An evidence-based with uncertainty, and recognising that I might be wrong. So I'm quite happy to say that what I present today, I might be wrong. And if that happens, that's fine. I've got no problem with that. I'll change my mind with the data. So I'll use this diagram to try and highlight the amount of data and the different ways in which data is generated and given to farmers. And what we have here is the on-station experiments that are very controlled and done by our PhD students, with high data integrity but low currency and relevance to the farming community that we're dealing with. What we really need for them are case studies. They enjoy having less data integrity but more currency and relevance. So when you think about where you're operating in that continuum. So the preacher, myths and legends, the politician, the lawyer, and also us, and then the scientists. So most of the information I'm going to be presenting is going to be from on-station experiments, models, simulation, but also some case study work. I found recently I also have to define what I'm talking about when I talk about science. And so for me, science is things made as simple as possible, but no simpler. A test against reality, the simplest check possible, do that, nothing more. And it's how we investigate the natural world. In the 1940s, there was some debate about what science actually is when the bomb was being created, and there were some scientists that were working at Albuquerque that decided that the Russians should also have the bomb. And so there was this debate about what is science and who should own science. But nobody does. Science is communal. It's got common ownership with collaboration. It's universal. It's evaluated independently through the peer review process. And once you've done the peer review process, it doesn't mean it's good science, it just means it's been published. How well it stacks up after that is then whether it's peer reviewed and whether it remains as science. Disinterested, I don't get paid more if there's more loose inside. Don't happen. Uncorrupted by self-interest and financial gain, and organised scepticism. And my example that I use with the students for that one in particular is genetically modified organisms. So we work in society's norms, and New Zealand society says we don't want GMOs currently. Other countries say they're fine. So our science has to be based and aware of the society's norms that we're operating in. So let's have a look at climate change, because that's what I was working on in the UK, what's happened since, the drivers of it, and mitigation versus adaptation. Our Land and Water, the National Science Challenge, did this double diagram from the agricultural community of New Zealand saying what are the biggest issues that we have that we're going to work on, and climate change clearly was one of those, with greenhouse gas emissions being an important component. most of us are aware, nitrous oxide, methane and CO2, that's what we're dealing with. I put this slide up because it was the very first slide that I put up in the very first lecture that I gave to Plant Science 321 about 35 years ago. And the interesting thing for me was I met one of the students that was in that class about 10 years later in a professional capacity, and he said to me, we thought you were mad. We took your notes and put them in the bin, and the only other thing we remember is that you kept out the people that arrived late. So I haven't done that today, but I still do that in the class if the opportunity exists. So let's have a look at some of those things. We need to improve fuel efficiency, double the price of petrol, cut emissions, and increase our percentage of road. We may be feeling the pain about petrol prices at the moment, but actually on an inflation-adjusted basis, they're about where they were in the 1980s, so we certainly haven't doubled the price of petrol. We've started to see a shift in the global use of transport. So on the left-hand side, the big blue bar is actually the Chinese using the sea for transporting a lot of goods. So we've moved away from some of the road, but you'll also see that the road percentage of freight in China has also increased. So we're not really meeting that requirement. Road transport is still one of the biggest drivers of climate change. The other major driver of climate change is, of course, our energy consumption. And so since about the 1960s, and keep an eye on the 1960s because that's pretty important, since about then, we have continued to see an increase in the use of fossil fuels, so coal, crude oil, natural gas, some nuclear, hydropower, wind, solar, modern biofuels, and the other renewables. So we've continued to burn and utilise fossil fuels, and the debate remains and continues to be the use of fossil fuels. Things like the price drive us towards renewables, and one of the things that's happened with renewables, and we're seeing a lot of it in New Zealand lately, is we're seeing a reduction in the price of solar panels. So we're seeing this come down very quickly, and the international, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their fifth assessment report, constructed some representative concentration pathways at that point in time, saying what would happen with different levels of CO2 in terms of watts per metre squared of energy that were going to be put onto the globe. And they created these scenarios, and they put on one which was RCP 2.6, 4.5, 6, and then 8.5, which was sort of a doomsday scenario. And you can see that the cost of solar panels has fallen well below what the predictions were in 2011. So we're actually doing better in that space than they predicted we would be in 2011. One of the challenges is for science is that when they created those scenarios, particularly the RCP 8.5, that has become business as usual. For a lot of policymakers, they looked at that and said that's what we've got to deal with. But RCP 8.5, which meant 8.5 watts of energy per metre squared added to that climate, was impossible. It was never a scenario that was plausible. And it's created a lot of problems because of that. It wasn't plausible because it assumed that we would continue to burn a lot of coal, and that hasn't happened. The difficulty is that we've developed a lot of our New Zealand policy, and our policymakers have done it, based on RCP 8.5. So we're overextending the impact of climate change. Personally, for me, we should be looking at extreme events. Those are the things we should be dealing with. But RCP 8.5 has done us no favours, and in fact, it's just come out recently that it's going to be retired with the next IPCC report that's being written at the moment. The problem with that is it's given the climate change deniers a leg. They now say, oh, you can't even agree on it. It was bad science to start with, and it should never have been put forward. It was gone by 2017 in the scientific literature. It had disappeared. But New Zealand embraced it and continued to do our policy development based on RCP 8.5. It's cost us a lot. What we do know is that the global population is increasing, and as we increase the population, we also increase energy consumption. It's a one-to-one relationship, and it's pretty strong. But the interesting thing, for those of you that have got some no hair or some grey hair that you can talk to your children and grandchildren about, is actually it's not a population increase because of birth rate. What we've got is a global decrease in birth rate. If we look here, there are only a couple of places where we're sitting above replacement. So Niger, West Africa, at 6.5 children. I think the population has come down even faster in West Africa than what was predicted 10 years ago. So education of women, feeding women actually produces the birth rate. And the birth rate in South Korea, 1.12. For New Zealand, it's 1.85. That Catholic-dominated country of Brazil, 1.74. So all of the world's countries, and most of the world's countries, are below replacement in terms of population. So that pressure coming from an increase in population is actually starting to ease as well, and it will over time. What we've got is estimated global fertility rates of about 2.2 in 2023, which is around replacement, 2.1 being replacement. So we've dropped, or are dropping, the rate at which that population is increasing. So one of those drivers is disappearing. What's actually happened is people are living longer. So the average life expectancy of people has actually increased, and it's increased since about the 1920s, particularly in the developed world, and then in the developing world it started to be later, but even in Africa we're now starting to see an increase in that population because of people living longer, not because we're having more births. In fact, one of the issues that's going forward that the demographers are talking about is what happens when we get back to having 6.4 billion people. Because we're going to have issues when there's a whole lot of things you don't have when you have a declining population. And that's one of the drivers, one of the things that will be dealt with in future. So, climate change is driven by fossil fuels for energy. Energy is related to population increase. And the population has increased through longevity, not fertility. The population decline will reduce the energy requirement. It won't offset all of the energy requirement, and we still need to do those things with renewables, and we still need to continue to reduce the use of fossil fuels. But that transition from fossil fuels to renewables is ongoing, and transport and energy sectors are the main contributors globally, and they are the ones that need to be, that are being worked on to try and reduce the amount of fossil fuel that they're utilising. That's the global situation. From a New Zealand perspective, I started working on, I came back from the UK and started working on, well, who's going to be most affected by climate change in New Zealand? It'll be East Coast sheep and beef farmers. They were already coping with variable climate, and when I started talking to them, I never discussed climate change. So 30 years ago, that wasn't a topic that you would have. I simply said, you have a variable climate, some years it's really dry, some years it's wet. How can we create systems that will benefit you? But they were the most affected, so that's where we set our research group operating predominantly. One of the things you need to understand is if you want to make change on farm, you have to understand what drives and motivates farmers. And if you want them to take up a technology or an idea that you have, you should better understand what it is that will be required to allow them to do it. And our farmers are probably no different from what the study is from, it's a McKinsey report from the US farmers, and it basically says farmers require a value proposition. So biochar as a fertiliser, for example, farmers perceive that as having a low rate of return, and therefore there's been low uptake. Whereas nitrogen stabilisers or inhibitors, they've seen as having a positive effect, and so there's been quite a lot of uptake. So that's a product change. The same thing with an equipment change, controlled irrigation practices, things like that. Essentially, farmers need to perceive a value proposition before they will make a change. And the same with a behavioural change. So it doesn't matter if it's a product, equipment, or behaviour, whatever sphere you're working in, you actually need to present the value proposition for the majority of them. Now, if you look at that one-to-one line, you'll see a lot of them the points are actually above the line, which suggests there are more farmers who will take it up than the perceived rate of return on investment. So they will try things. They're actually wanting to embrace things and do things if they possibly can. So let's have a look at the value proposition that we've given them from our mitigation response. The only figure that I'm not comfortable with is the one that I got from AI, which is the $1 billion figure. I got it to find for me the math reports of how much money New Zealand has actually spent on greenhouse gas emissions over the last 20 years, and it went through the MPI reports and came up with $1 billion. So I went back through as many of those as I could find. It's about $1 billion over 20 years. And we spent that money on genetics, methane inhibitors, vaccines, nitrous oxide inhibitors, genetics modified ryegrass, clover, probiotics, etc. At the moment, there is not one scientific and technological mitigation which is significant, does not have significant barriers to use, effectively precluding adoption. So at the moment, we don't have anything available to our farmers that meets that fundamental requirement of where is the value proposition? There's none. And the horizon says there isn't either. If you think about the greenhouse gas emissions, people are talking about a 10% reduction, which would be 4 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents by 2030. If we spend $1 billion doing that and we can reduce by 4 million tonnes, that would be about $250 per tonne of carbon. The current price of carbon is $54 per tonne. There isn't a value proposition. I have no problem with New Zealand having spent research money on trying to reduce methane production from our ruminants. What I have a problem with is that it's been at the exclusion of every other avenue that we might have had and taken as we went through the last 20 years. It's essentially taken all of the research money. And the same thing is going to happen now as we move. The pillars have changed and we've got another set of criteria that scientists are going to have to work off to try and identify where they go and do their research. I think it's a very short-sighted way in which we operate our government funding model. The other thing that changes is the science. So the global warming potential initially was based on GWP 100, which was what is the global warming potential of each of the gases over 100 years. And what came out in about 2017 was that there is a difference in if you have a static state of methane emissions or a static state of carbon dioxide emissions, your contribution to warming actually changes. And for static methane emissions, you have no additional warming. So from a biogenic methane perspective, which is the stuff produced by cows or our ruminants, effectively it's a very short-lived gas, and it was created from carbon dioxide and water being joined in a process called photosynthesis, which gave them some biomass, which they ingested, which then they produced some methane. And that methane then goes back into CO2. Our current livestock numbers in New Zealand are actually stable, so our contribution to warming is actually stable from a methane perspective. It's not increasing. We've got, in fact, in the sheep and beef sector, it's declining. That's not to say we shouldn't be doing it, but it's to say should all of our money be going in that direction or not? I don't think so. The Ministry of the Environment in 2017 said New Zealand's methane contribution has been stable since 2017. In 2024, that was the statement that we had. So we basically have headed in another direction. I never was going to do the pure science required, and I'm very grateful that there are people who are doing the pure science for the greenhouse gas and the vaccines and all of the things that are happening. For us, it was more farmer-facing and adaptation. So our 20-year funding model has been about $10 million. We've done some simple high data integrity experiments where we've quantified water and nitrogen responses, and we've translated that research onto farms. I'm going to give you some examples from some of the work and the impact we've had on summer safe and grain properties, and also our current work around regenerative agriculture. So if you've heard me speak before, you'll have seen these slides. This is from Anna Mills' PhD. Effectively what we did was we took a block of land on the Canterbury Plains, actually down in Iverson Field, and we said, what happens if I just add water versus what happens if I just add nitrogen versus what happens if I add both water and nitrogen. Very simple experiment, going back to my initial points about simple experiments done. For anybody that knows Canterbury, this is a pretty typical dryland pasture production curve. About 6.3 tonnes of dry matter is what you would get. If you just add water, you'll produce about 10 tonnes of dry matter. You won't get any response through spring because you've already got moisture in the soil, so you're not expecting a response at that time. Your response will come when we run out of moisture. What happened is I spent $40,000 a hectare on a centre-pivot irrigator, and I added water, and I hardly got any response. So the thing that happened is I then added nitrogen. And that's what our dairy farmers do. And the numbers are, I'm not going to go into that in great detail, I've done that previously, but you can work out how much nitrogen they would have had to apply, and they were applying about 400 kilos of N, because that's what you need to produce 22 tonnes of dry matter. So we went to summer safe environments, those that are that get summer rainfall, and said, well, can we help you with your summer safe environment to recognise what the limitation is to your pasture production, which is a lack of nitrogen, but do it without you needing to utilise urea fertiliser, which is a product of natural gas. So it's a fossil fuel derived product. And so we've worked with farmers and created this what I call satellite farming, in this case a mixture of plantain with a lot of red and white clover, and creating a pasture that is more productive than what his resident pastures were. And we've got to about that 20 tonnes of dry matter that I said we were able to produce down here when we added water and nitrogen. So over a 4-year period, 3 years of very legume dominant pastures, and then following that with some Italian ryegrass, the technicalities of which we don't need to go into today, just to show it is possible, done with no oil wells, just with using appropriate species in the appropriate place. In addition to that, we've said that a lot of the data we collect is really useful to other people, and so we've created a database called Ag Yields, which is hosted here at Lincoln University. It's an open access database that now has 70,000 data points in it. So Carmen Teixeira is here, and she effectively is the person who runs that database. Because there's a lot of data that farmers collect that disappears. There's a lot of people that do research, they get their funding and it sits for 3 years, they do a report and it's gone. So Ag Yields has been created to try and say, hey, look, there's value in all of that, and New Zealand Inc. actually paid for that. So the public paid for that research. Let's make sure that data is available. So adaptation, science-based responses to climate change. Summer dry sheep and beef systems is where we put most of our emphasis. The interesting result from Anna's PhD was that when we took that 6.3 tonnes of dry matter and we just added nitrogen, we were able to produce 16 tonnes of dry matter. So that's a huge increase, with 2.5 times as much herbage off the same area of land. We then went on farm, and we did that on farm. So we compared, this is an example from Banks Peninsula, where we had lucerne growing on a commercial farm. Thank you, Matt. And we looked at the improved and unimproved. And of course, you get a variation in the yield that you're expecting with the rainfall that you get. So this is 3 years of data. An average year about 5.4, a dry year 3.3 tonnes, and then a wetter year giving an 8.5 tonnes. On average, about 6 tonnes of dry matter. So exactly what we would expect from the data we've done previously. The lucerne, if we add those three numbers up, 14 plus 10 is 24, and 18 is 34, 42, close enough, about 14 tonnes of dry matter. So that's the potential that's sitting there simply by having the right legume in the right place and giving that farmer the opportunity to then utilise it. That's the first part. The second part is they then try and graze it, so you get a whole lot of other problems come along, and you've got to sort those out for them as well. And for those that know my history a little bit, you'll know that I did a lot of that with a farmer called Doug Avery from Marlborough. And Doug wrote up his story in that book. And I'm not going to dwell on Doug's property or the data from there, because that property has increased in size and very difficult to talk about without explaining it in great detail. But what I learned in that interaction with the farmers is that most farmers have optimised their system. They understand how their system operates. And so they have this plateau where their output has become stable. And then we come along and we offer them a new cultivar or some fertiliser, and we get incremental change. But what I'm trying to do, what we're trying to do, is implement a totally new technology. And farmers are just people. They're just the same as the rest of us. If you give someone a new technology, it takes them a while to work it out. So I come along to Doug's place and I say, Doug, I want you to graze your lucerne. He goes home, grazes his lucerne, no backup, kills 200 ewes. Because there is going to be some negative output the first time that he tries to do things. And so this is what we need to understand. But what we're trying to achieve is not incremental change, it's transformational change. It's step change. So there's going to be some system problems there. There's going to be some negative output, and during that period there's a risk of reversion. And that's when the agribusiness community needs to come along and help. So our job is not to say to farmers, you're not going to have problems when you implement a new idea that I'm giving you, but give them the skills to be able to do it and give them the backup. That's what the agribusiness community is here for. That's what I see our role as being, and that's what I've seen the students and those that I've been fortunate enough to educate go out and do. Because we want to minimise that period of negative output, and therefore that period we would make a risk of reversion. So the case study that I thought I'd present to you is from Bob Roy Station, because it's a contained high country station. So the farmer from Bob Roy sat in my office. His wife was a rabies down rep and a BAg honours graduate, was coming to ask me a technical question when she was working, and he sat there and he picked up the field day that we had at Fornavra and he said, can I do that on my farm? And he described his farm to me and I said, no, you're an idiot. And he, not quite like that. I basically said that what he had is a farm system that wasn't set for the production that he had. He was trying to do things in the middle of summer in the high country when he had no moisture. So he was trying to finish animals at a time of the year when he just absolutely couldn't do it. So we took his system to pieces over time. It's a small high country property and gradually increased the area of dryland lucerne from around 30 hectares to 350 hectares. It's a 420 millimetre rainfall environment. Canterbury's about 600, 650 depending on where you are. So we're talking dry. What happened in that system, 2008, he was producing about 90 tonnes of weaned lamb. And I think you can see the transformation of change that I was trying to illustrate before, the step change that's happened on that property. What we've done initially is the number of ewes didn't really change. So in 2008, we went in and sort of started this implementation. And what happened is the ewes were in better condition. For those that aren't animal scientists, we call that their condition score. So we improved how good mum was, and therefore mum became a better mum, and we had greater lamb survival. So not a lot of change there happening in terms of the ewe numbers, but as we grew more feed, because remember we're doing at least 7.5 tonnes per hectare more than he was, then we increased the ewe numbers, and more recently we've started to see hogget lambing, and that hogget lambing has meant we can decrease the ewe numbers. So if you can lamb hoggets, which are young sheep, then actually you don't have to keep them for 18 months when they're not productive. So hogget merino lambing is pretty unusual. From a financial perspective, there's a clear value proposition here. So the details are actually in papers that we published, so I'm not going to go through them, but you can look at the difference between 2012, we didn't do the numbers in 2008 when we first started, but by 2024, 2025, we're looking at about $500,000 a year extra income for that farm with a clear value proposition. Gengaro is looking at how that might work with using machine learning and some AI modelling to look at how that could work across the rest of New Zealand. So there's an opportunity on about 440,000 hectares if we took 5% of the land area to grow an extra 7.5 tonnes, which would give us 3.1 billion kilograms at 15 cents a kilogram, is about $500 million a year sitting behind the farm gate, easily accessible that we could do if we had opportunity to go out and do that extension. Not going to cost us very much, we already know how to do it. Okay, so what other opportunities or options have we got? Well, potentially regenerative agriculture. So we've got work happening in the regenerative agricultural space. One of the first things that happened when this hit New Zealand was I wrote to the Minister at the time, Damien O'Connor, and I said, we need some data on this. And fortunately, he actually put some programs together, and so we now have a program of workers. We're a self-contract capacity university, and we have a regenerative agriculture dryland experiment that we compare it. There's a lot of regen versus conventional agriculture that is synergistic. It's exactly the same. A lot of things that we would encourage and promote. Our regenerative grazing experiment is multi-species versus the lucerne-based system that I've just described to you, and we collect a lot of data off it, and we look through what is the value proposition from that. It's 8 hectares, 80 plots, 4 farmlets, managed by Dr. Alistair Black, who's here. because it's my system that's the conventional one, so I have nothing to do with the management of it. I leave that, I just tear my hair out at times at seeing what he's doing, but it works. And so that's what they're doing. We're now into year 5, and so Luke Robb's PhD has been showing us the difference between those systems, and on average, there is about a 15 to 20% advantage to the conventional system over the regenerative system at this stage. Whether that stays like that or not, we'll find out. But it's not surprising, because if we look at more commonly known data from cropping systems, remember agriculture in New Zealand is generally pastoral, but everywhere else in the world it's arable. We look at those arable data, it's about the same. Conventional agriculture has about a 15 to 20% advantage. So we now understand that if people want us to farm with regenerative agriculture, we're going to need a premium of about 15 to 20% to cover the cost difference in production that's occurring at this stage. Obart is looking at why, so looking at the digestibility of feed and showing us that most of that is coming through the spring period, and we're also looking at the gas that's being produced off that and showing that the conventional system is actually producing fewer greenhouse or less greenhouse gas emissions than the regenerative system, because it has lower fibre content in it. So the details again will come through. We're also looking at the soil, so Brianna Holt's here, and she's looking at carbon fluxes to see what's happening. So if there is more carbon being sequestered by the regenerative system, fantastic. How much is it, and can we put a price on it? So those are the things that we can look at over time. Just want to finish up, and I'll put there welcome to join it. So this is a 8-hectare plot. We've had people from all sorts of walks of life come and join, and effectively we have the technical people that are collecting the base data, but anything anybody wants to come and collect, Alistair's very happy to hear from them, and we're happy to engage with people who may want to get involved in that project. Very happy, whether that be technical science stuff or some of the sociology stuff. Very happy to see you. I wanted to finish just by thinking broadly about what is the role for science in New Zealand, because I think we've lost our way a little bit. Anyone recognise that photo? The space shuttle blowing. Okay, and the engineer who I have a lot of time for, Richard Feynman, wrote, this was the result of top-down rather than bottom-up engineering. He's quoted as saying basically that the people who know how things operate are at the bottom of the systems. But that was actually his quote. And I think New Zealand's had that same problem. There were meth houses. They were all going to be a problem. We had a whole industry created of pulling meth houses out whenever anybody wanted to get a flat, until Sir Peter Glutton came along and said, this is nonsense. The dose is ridiculous. I think we've lost that, and our science community has lost the ability to do that. Glyphosate, chlorinated water, fluoride, nitrate. We're not leading the debate. We're not actually in the debate. The science community's not there. We've lost that ability to do it. I put nitrate up for the students as an example. And high-performance athletes eat it. They want to get as much nitrate as they possibly can. It reduces your blood pressure. It allows them to work harder. It's a preservative in canned food. Professor Frizzell from the Canterbury University says there's no risk of bowel cancer. Blue baby syndrome is predominantly the cases that have been reported are mostly due to E. coli, not due to nitrate poisoning. So low or no risk for human health. I put that out as an example because I think what's happened is for the past 30 years, public policy in the EU and New Zealand has been guided by the precautionary principle. What we've said is we've taken a hazard-based approach that ignores exposure levels. A demand that all products be 100% safe. A docile population that expects to live risk-free. It's not going to happen. So we've stopped looking at what is the risk of exposure. We've basically said any risk is too much. That's given us a decline in economic wealth and a decline in our research capability. It's given us a weakened public resilience, vulnerable to misinformation. Is it time that we return to a risk-based policy approach? I think so. My last slide, because I know, Katie, we're getting towards time, is to say, well, why haven't we done that? I came across this literature recently on psychological safety, and I think it's a really good illustration of where the science community is operating. Hopefully, we're not sitting in the exclusion component here, whereby we don't feel that we have permission to do anything and we have a low level of respect. Without wanting to put words in their mouth, I think this is where most Uber drivers or Diddy drivers or Amazon workers might feel they operate. They really have no power. I think at a university we're trying to create an inclusion safety zone where we include the group of people. You can imagine being a new All Black and you go into the All Black environment and you sort of just don't really feel like you belong yet. And so you're hoping that you can be included. And then we can contribute, we can learn and we can contribute. And so that's really the journey that we try and take our postgraduate students on, that they feel safe in the learning environment. They feel safe to ask questions. They feel safe to be able to contribute. But where we lack is I think most of our science community sits in the contributor safety zone. I don't think we've operated in the challenger safety zone. I think we've got managerialism to the point that people are not prepared to speak up and challenge a doctrine of the day. I think we've lost that ability to question appropriately and challenge the information that we're being given. And that's the role of science. That's what we should actually be doing. We've become passive, we've become takers of what should be happening. We haven't become challengers. This data has actually been generated for businesses and said, well, what are the most innovative and the businesses that are the most successful? And they sit in that challenger space where paternalism, so the CEO, the boss, doesn't see themselves as a boss, they see themselves as encouraging and giving permission to people to challenge their authority or challenge what's being said. I think we've lost that. I think it's been to the detriment of New Zealand science and the New Zealand community over time. So, the data currently, climate change is still driven by fossil fuel. Mitigation from GWP to biogenic methane, debatable whether it's been successful or not. I think our adaptation case studies have been. We now know what the premium might need to be if I want to have something produced from a regenerative agricultural system. But we need to think a little bit more about whether it's preachers, politicians, prosecutors or scientists that we want to lead public debates. And if we want it to be scientists, then challenger safety means to be there to drive science innovation. But I might be wrong. And that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derrick, for an absolutely insightful presentation there. Great opportunity now for questions of Derrick and points of clarification. If you would just put a name to yourself as you're answering these questions, please, and speak nice and loudly, please.
I'm Fayaz Kadir. Actually, I'm doing my research on climate finance, and it was a wonderful insight through your presentation. I learned just a little point to make to discuss with you. You discussed the population rise and energy consumption and the risk to the climate change. Just to point out, what do you think an average consumption of energy in the developed country, for example, New Zealand, will be multiple times of the use of
100 times more than
absolutely Africa.
Absolutely, and the developed world is if you go back and look at the data and you look at the use of the countries that are telling us all to do things, the UK, the US, the EU are all the ones that have produced it. The developing countries, their contribution is minor. I have no issue with that at all.
Petrol use in New Zealand.
Sorry?
Petrol use in New Zealand.
Petrol is exactly the same sort of thing. So, so how do we best deal with those things, right? And I think price is a really good motivator. And although we may not like the price of petrol going up, actually it's causing globally more people to think about their use of fossil fuels. There aren't easy answers for that. My process, though, from a farming perspective is I think we'll cope with global, I call it heating, because I think warming's too comfortable. We'll cope with global heating. We won't cope with the extremes. So if I was doing policy, my policies would be dealing with extremes.
Exactly.
Floods, fires, particularly floods. That's where I would be putting the money, the $1 billion, I'd be putting it there.
Thank you. Question.
Hi there, Naomi. I was wondering if you had a nice graph where you said farmers are currently have optimized their system. They're kind of working at a plateau. You asked them to change things. But have you noticed farmers feeling like they're not at a plateau anymore, that they're kind of feeling these extreme events or climate change in a way that people are starting to feel uncomfortable, or like, shit, we need something new because what we were doing isn't working, or is that not really?
Look, I guess I'm fortunate. I deal with the farmers who are open to suggestion and doing things, and so most of those have made the change. Those who are fast followers are doing it as well, and there is a group that will be left behind. And unless they adapt and they adopt, then they will be left behind. I don't think 30 years ago we were predicting that the climate change for New Zealand would be warmer winters, drier summers, and potentially rainfall events. And that's what we've got. It's warmer winters. Actually, we're one of the winners. A warmer winter is actually quite beneficial to a lot of our farming. Now, is that going to be the case in 100 years' time? Possibly not. But I personally back farmers to be able to adapt to that. What I don't think they can adapt to are the extremes. And I think that's where we should be looking. As a country, what are the extremes and how are we insulating not just the farming community, but the whole community to those large events rather than the incremental change. That where we sit geographically is less than, for example, what we're seeing in Europe at the moment.
Derrick, I'll have a question about the New Zealand science system. We've seen reforms to it, which largely looks at the development of emission and pillars in particular, and increasing their mission-led science. We've also seen some modification to the balance probably between mission-led science and investigative-led science. Do you have any commentary around that from your point of view and experience?
Well, Grant, from my point of view is my science was done by, I think this is what needs to be done, and I went and did it. And I didn't go out, I spent 15 years with no funding. I just had really good PhD students and good ideas and said, this is what I think needs to be done. And I think that's actually the best science that happens. I actually personally shy away from large programs that involve a lot of people because I find I end up spending all my time in a meeting and I don't actually achieve very much. And I'm a doer, I'm a pragmatist. So I want to get things done. I've only got one career and it's almost over. So, I haven't got time to be sitting in a meeting discussing what our next proposal might be that in 20 years' time might give a response. It's not me. So other people might enjoy that, but that's not me. I want, and the people I work with, we're in the service of the rural community. I'm trying to solve problems that the farmers and the rural community has now.
Thank you. A question here and then. Yeah.
Thank you, Kenneth Irons. I've got an interest in ag tech and ISO standards. I was in Simon Upton's announcement today with the Parliamentary Commissioner Environment for the creation of a federated data system for environmental data in New Zealand, and I was surprised how silent he was about the whole farming sector in that context. What's your view on that?
Well, yeah, I agree. I think we've lost sight of what is our biggest business. People may want to think that things are going to change, but when I was starting my agricultural career, it was a sunset industry. Well, the sun's set on an $80 billion industry that's still the mainstay of New Zealand production systems. It's a biological system that we operated in, and we are not going to be into extractive industrials. What surprises me is we don't have those databases. We don't have those agricultural databases, and that's one of the reasons that we set up Ag Yields. We said there's been a lot of investment in New Zealand pastoral data and cropping data, but it's all over the place. How do we take advantage of the digital transformation that's coming with the new people who are young and got the widgets and can do all of that stuff if they don't have data?
Well, they've got the data, they just don't have the intelligent infrastructure to connect it all to a standards-based system.
Correct. And that needs to happen.
Right.
And open access, I think, would be really useful, which is what we've tried to provide.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter.
Two things that happened since you started your career. We used to have a whole lot of agricultural advisors that were run out of MPIs, possibly beyond that back then. I mean, and now farmers are sold on all sides by all sorts of people peddling all sorts of products, and that's been a fundamental change since you started. The other thing too is that the science, basically science funding has dropped probably in real terms. a lot of scientists are forced to take on commercial contracts.
Absolutely.
You're talking about timidity, it's because they fear not upsetting anybody for fear of losing their economy.
Peter, I couldn't agree more, but I think that's, that is what has driven a reduction in both science funding and our economic wealth. We need those people that are prepared to stand up and say, this is not right, this is how it needs to happen. But what we normally do with those people is we cut them off at the knees. When in fact, we actually need to embrace those people, and the mavericks and the outsiders tend to be the most innovative. If you want to get the status quo, join a group of insiders. If you want something to happen, the outsiders are not in the tent.
Thank you. An opportunity for two last questions. So there was one.
Oh, never mind.
Sorry? And one at the back here, please.
I have a question about climate change, how machine learning modeling can respond to climate change.
I'm not the person to answer that question.
Actually, I'm doing research on that. I want to check from you, like whether how you can answer me or.
Well, I think there are people that are smarter than I that can do that, and I'm working with some of those because I think that's important. We're currently using machine learning for taking some of the data that we've got and trying to develop systems for farmers to be able to choose which species they might use in a particular environment. We're using machine learning to try and identify where we might have the best opportunity to add value to a farm or a landscape by what's the optimal use of that particular landscape. But from a climate change perspective, that's not me. I follow the science. I was involved very early. I worked with some of the people that wrote the initial IPCC reports, but I really am not engaged in that climate science space, so I apologise.
Sharon, give me the lucky last, please.
Yeah, I'm sure. Given your view on science and on funding and on the current environment of tertiary education, what should we do as educators to teach our young people coming along? What are the key things that, in your eyes, that we should be focused on?
Well, they need to learn how to think. That's it. They need to get a foundation, a solid foundation of first principles. All of us who have been successful at science or any career, you have to understand first principles. If you can't understand first principles, then you will be duped in whatever you're doing, and actually you will put in a proposal that somebody who understands first principles will go, that's just not going to work. You can't do it. So as educators, I think that the main thing is that you don't have to be a scientist to think like a scientist. Okay? And the idea of thinking like a scientist is to take the data available and change your mind. And that's the key component. I'm happy if in 20 years' time someone comes along and says, what Moot did was terrible. Okay, that's cool. What I did is what I thought was best at the time. But I'm not wedded to it. If there's a better system comes along, we need to move to it. And I think the problem we have is we have a seize and freeze mentality. So what in the psychology literature, what that means is that we get an idea and we seize on it and we freeze with it. And that's what we did with RCP 8.5 in 2011. We saw that and said, that's the scenario, that's the only one we're going to do. It's what we did with GWP 100. We seized it and said, that's it, we're going to make policy based on that. Well, the science has changed. And we need to teach people that science can change and uncertainty is okay. And they can't live in a risk-free environment.
Derrick, many thank you for your presentation today. It's a great presentation, insightful around adaptation, how you've engaged your students, your community of farmers in particular, to bring them on the journey and make real impact to the lives of many people through the advancements they've made. So really a significant contribution there that has been demonstrated through this presentation. Also the great insights you've given into your approach to science and your thoughts around that and how that can lead to really good adoption is really valuable to have here today. Thank you very much, Liz.